is all about today with vulnerability management. So I do hope you find today's event useful and informative to assisting you and your organizations to better prepare for these critical eventualities and eventualities that are unfortunately on everyone's doorstep. So to no further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Matthew Green from Digital Era. Matt?
Thank you for that introduction, Lloyd and Matthew, and just let everyone know Digital Era Group has been a long partner with CCS, and we appreciate the opportunity to meet today to discuss these important topics. So real quick, just to give you a little background, everybody who's on the webinar about Digital Era Group, we are a managed service provider with a specialty in cybersecurity. We offer all sorts of services related not just to infrastructure management, but specifically to cybersecurity. And in today's presentation, we'll be discussing vulnerability management. But throughout the presentation, I will probably point out some areas of concern that might fall a little bit outside the scope of vulnerability management. So don't hesitate to ask any questions or write your questions down as we go out this presentation. And like Matthew said earlier, at the end of the presentation, we'll do our best to address everyone's questions. So with that, I just want to quickly cover the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to talk about 2021 security trends that we're seeing out there, top security facts, top facts related around ransomware. We're going to discuss a few metrics around COVID-19 specifics. Breaches and hacking. We're going to talk about the modern attack surface as well. And at that point, we're going to get into actual vulnerability management, the actual process, a good way to implement it. And we'll talk about, from a services perspective, how that can be of assistance to your organization. And at the end, we'll do a little Q&A. So before I get into the presentation, just real quick about me. My name is Matt Green. We have a couple of Matts on here, but I am the Director of Services at Digital Era Group. I've been with Digital Era for about 3 years. In my prior lifetime before joining Digital Era Group, I was a federal contractor at Kennedy Space Center. I worked on the largest IT contract at the time, and I was one of the spearheads behind managing risk management for 9 different security plans, and that covered well over 5,000 different systems. And so I have a ton of experience when it comes to vulnerability management and working with IT teams and management. And so with that, we'll get right into the 2021 trends. So the first thing is an obvious thing. Due to COVID, we know that remote work has become very, very popular. And with that, unfortunately, remote workers are going to continually be targeted by cyber criminals. A lot of times, cyber criminals deem that those are easy targets, so remote workers are going to be under constant attack. As a side effect of remote workforces, cloud breaches are going to really start to skyrocket and increase. The cybersecurity skills gap still is a huge issue, and really the challenge behind that is there's a huge disparity in what larger organizations from a budgetary standpoint and from a skills standpoint can offer that smaller SMBs have a challenge with. A lot of time employees will come in or resources will come into smaller organizations, they get trained up, and then usually they usually leave the organization, right, to go to larger organizations. So the really challenge behind the SMB market is how do we get somebody who can cover that skills gap and we can retain those skills so that we are properly securing our environment. And as a result of 5G, you're going to see Internet of Things really start to become a major target, right? And so to give you some simple examples, Internet of Things are things like thermostats. If you have a Nest in your home, or you even have an Alexa, right? Those are considered Internet of Things devices. So those are going to start to experience major attacks. So when we talk about top facts, right? So let's start off with 95% of security breaches are caused by human error, right? And then that would include things like phishing attempts where individuals receive an email and they get tricked into clicking stuff, right? 88% of organizations worldwide experience spear phishing attempts, meaning they are specifically targeted, right? especially with the COVID-19 situation. What we've seen is that there's a lot of fake human resource emails going out to folks within the company. And of course, naturally, as an employee, you see an email like that and you think, okay, this is something specific from human resources that is related to, our organization and our COVID plan. And naturally, they click on it. 68% of business leaders feel that their cybersecurity risks are increasing. On average, only 5% company folders are properly protected. That's a pretty staggering statistic right there. A ton of companies are using file shares, whether it's locally on premise or in the cloud. And as you can see there, Varonis, they are a data security and classification vendor. They have a ton of customers that they pulled those surveys from. Only 5% are properly protected. Data breaches typically in 2020 exposed 36 billion records in the first half of 2020. 86% of breaches were financially motivated, whereas 10% were only motivated by espionage. I don't think that that's a surprising fact, but it just proves that most of the time breaches are due to financial motivation. And then the top malicious email attachments are typically standard Word documents or old Word doc files. It makes up 37% of those attachments that get clicked on. And then the next highest are executables, according to Symantec. So let's talk about the top facts related to ransomware. Ransomware remains obviously the most prominent malware threat. We see it in the news. If you do any sort of Google for hacking or breaches, ransomware is always going to be at the top. It's really started to take off since 2018, and it's only going to continue to skyrocket. The average ransomware payment in 2021 increased by 82%. And now the average ransom is basically a $570,000 ask. The largest ransom demand ever observed to date is $100 million. 37% of respondents from organizations that were affected by ransomware attacks were actually reported last year. And in 2021, the largest ransomware payout by an insurance company, an organization that deals with cybersecurity insurance, paid out a world record $40 million. According to Cybercrime Magazine, they say that a ransomware attack will occur every 11 seconds. So while we're doing this webinar, I'll let you guys do the math to find out what that actual number is just in the next 30 minutes. And then the average downtime for a company that experiences ransomware is 21 days. And 21 days we're referring to they can't do business. Digital Air Group has been involved with many incident responses where the actual business couldn't log in. They had to send their employees home. They couldn't service their end customers. So ransomware is a very serious thing, and it can cripple your organization. So let's talk about the COVID-19 specific facts. Since COVID-19 began, the FBI has reported a 300% increase in cybercrime. 27% of cyber attacks related to COVID-19 target banks and healthcare organizations. As you can see there, that's a 238% rise. Confirmed data breaches are really troublesome in the healthcare industry. Again, if you do a Google search, you'll find that healthcare, there's tons of articles you're going to find where healthcare providers have been targeted, and they don't limit it to large, big hospitals. They're going after small organizations, small little doctors' offices, dentists. Unfortunately, the bad guys just do not care. In April of 2020, Google blocked 18 million daily malware and phishing emails. So that tells you how serious it is and the sort of effort that bad guys are taking to push out these targeted attacks related around COVID-19. Remote work has increased the average cost of a data breach tremendously. It's up to $137,000 according to IBM. And some of these breaches and hacking items are current up to big events that happened in the past. The first one that we have here, the average cost of a data breach is $3.86 million as of 2020. The average time to identify a breach, meaning that by the time cybersecurity teams realize that something has occurred, 207 days have already passed. Personal data is almost always involved with the breaches. And in 2020, Twitter experienced a breach where about 130 of their accounts were targeted. High-level accounts like Elon Musk were targeted, as well as past presidents, and ended up 121,000 in Bitcoin was nearly transacted because of that. In 2020, Marriott hotels, I'm sure a lot of folks on this webinar have stayed at Marriott's, but you may not be aware that 5.2 million hotel guest records were disclosed due to a security breach. And then one of the most famous breaches of all time is the Equifax breach. Happened a few years ago, but it cost the company over $4 billion in total to get that resolved. And so you might be saying to yourself, those are pretty some alarming statistics. There's big dollars behind it. Why is it so easy to go in and get breached? Why is it so easy for ransomware to be delivered and take over organizations? And there's a couple of reasons. The primary one is that our attack surface is greatly expanding than what it does in the past few years. Traditionally, in the past, most organizations only had to deal with IT, and IT covers what you see there in blue. Those are standard concepts or standard cyber assets that are being protected, your servers, your desktops, and your network infrastructure. As mobile capabilities became about, organizations started to issue out mobile phones, laptops, virtual machines started to become widely used, and even web applications. And this is where the beginning of SaaS began to really take hold out in the world. And now we have cloud, right? So a lot of organizations are leveraging at a minimum some sort of cloud service. It's not uncommon for them to use hybrid type concepts where they have some stuff in the cloud, some stuff on premise. And then you have a lot of new organizations that are completely remote. They don't have any physical buildings, so they're totally leveraging the cloud 100%. Now you introduce IoT things, things like Alexas and devices that control HVAC systems, systems that control physical access to things like your building and your data center. And your attack surface is very large, and it makes it very difficult to protect all these things, just because the fact that resources within an organization typically have an increase, but your attack surface has. And so really, when we talk about how do you avoid becoming a statistic on those first few slides that we talk about, there's really three key questions that an organization needs to ask of themselves. And it's, when we look at that attack surface, is number one, where are we exposed as an organization, right? That's a big question. The next thing is, once we know where we're exposed, what should we fix first? What should we address first based off the risk to our organization, right? And then lastly, how do we build something, a system that reduces our exposure all the time, because new threats are coming out daily, and we need to make sure that we are improving upon that to get ahead of the bad guys as much as possible, right? And so these three questions are addressed in what we call vulnerability management program. A good vulnerability management program will answer where the organization's exposed. It will identify where is the most risk to your business, right? And this is in terms of, hey, if something went down, would I be able to function as a business at this point? Would I be able to provide services to my end customers, right? And so vulnerability management seems like an obvious thing, but it's not something that's easy to implement and do. And the reason is because, number one, your asset inventory and the way that you manage assets is critical. If you don't have good practices in place to know what's in your environment, how do you know what to protect? How do you know what to address? How do you know which systems are critical to your business? So it's very important that you have a good understanding of the type of cyber assets that are in your organization. It's well documented, and you have a good systematic management approach to make sure that those inventories are always properly updated. Next, you have new threats coming out daily. IT teams are constantly working on new projects. They're doing their best to keep the lights on. They're servicing customers. They're wearing a ton of hats, right? And management's heavily involved in all those areas as well. So combating new threats daily just makes it that much more difficult. And because of those new threats that are taking place daily, that means new patches are being released daily. And it's difficult to track all the new patches that are coming out and to make sure that you're timely deploying them to address the particular vulnerabilities. And in some cases, a lot of times actually, it's not even related to a patch. You might have a new vulnerability that exists due to a system configuration or misconfiguration, or you might need to adjust a hardening setting on a system. So imagine if you have, even just 50 systems, for example, that's a pretty challenging task when you're trying to do all the other things that IT is involved in. The next thing is what should remediate first? And that goes back to that first bullet point. Our asset inventory management is key to that, because that's what's going to tell us from a risk standpoint what we should probably be looking at first from a remediation perspective. Then you have the time lag, right? The amount of time it takes to test and then deploy the patch, right? You don't want to just randomly go out and say, oh, there's a security risk here, let's just throw a patch on it, right? Ideally, you would like to do some sort of level of testing, because it's not uncommon for somebody to roll out a patch and it break a particular application that might be running on that server or that system. And then who is reporting and tracking the risk, right? So if we go back to all the new threats, we go back to all the new patches that are coming out to address those threats, who is the team or the individual responsible for spearheading this stuff and then reporting back to management what's going on, where is the exposure of the organization, and more importantly, how you're addressing it. So the solution is really to create a systematic process that is constantly staying on top of vulnerabilities, right? And how those are being managed. So the first key, if we go back to the previous slide, we really focused on the asset management piece, but what's key is you need to have very good asset discovery, classification, and up-to-date inventory. There's a variety of ways that you can do that. You can use a combination of tools, but you also need to have a systematic process behind the tool. Tool is great for collecting this information and recording it, but you need to have other built-in processes that are related to use cases, like when you introduce a new system to your environment, right? Do you go through, do you scan it? Do you make sure that you put it in the asset management list? Do you go through a classification process, right? And so there's a lot of things you need to do there to make sure that that information is always up to date and current. And just a little side note here, as I go through these slides, this stuff can become overwhelming. It sounds like there's, wow, there's a lot of things that you need to do when it comes to a vulnerability management solution. These are all the little steps that we typically recommend to address things like compliance and so on. But when you're in a smaller organization, these are things that you can do very quickly, right? You're probably going to have a resource that's in a role that's wearing multiple hats. Again, you can also reach out to a managed service provider, like a Digital AR Group or CCS. They have systems and processes in place that basically will do the things that we're talking about on today's webinar as a service. It's all inclusive. So don't get overwhelmed as we go through these different bullet points and you see, wow, man, there's a lot of stuff we have to do here. We're just breaking down the details so that you get a clear picture of all of the things you need to be thinking about when it comes to implementing a vulnerability management program. So the next thing we need to do is define a central point. Who is centrally responsible for the remediation efforts? Who's going to provide that remediation and mitigation information? In other words, when a vulnerability comes out, somebody needs to determine how to properly fix it and then hand that information over to the implementers, the IT team, who is then going to go out and apply the remediations. You want to make sure that you are addressing the time issue, right? If something comes out that is a high threat, you typically want to take care of that, pretty fast. We recommend if it's a critical, for example, that's probably something you want to resolve in the first 7 days. And then you need to make sure that ultimately there is a central point that is tracking the risk for the organization and then doing this continually, right? So the reporting back to management, hey, last week we ran a vulnerability scan. We went through our vulnerability management process. We identified the areas of concern. We worked with IT. We rolled out these patches, made these configuration changes, and here's where we're at today. That information needs to constantly be flowing back and forth up to senior management so that they are aware of the potential risk and how it was resolved, or maybe it might not have been resolved. They need to know that information. So at a high level, that's what you're trying to accomplish with your vulnerability management program. We're now going to get into the actual overview or the foundation pieces of what it takes to implement one. And again, a managed service provider is going to be doing these things for you. But even if a managed service provider is doing these things for you, you as an organization need to understand what that service provider is doing, how they're doing it, because you as a stakeholder are going to be providing input into this process. So it's very important that you understand the vulnerability management process itself, how it's going to work, so they can make adjustments that are related to your business, right? Because every business is different. So in the overview phase, when we're rolling out a vulnerability management program, the first thing we want to do is define a strategy. Okay, and that strategy would include things like what do we need to address from an organization perspective. Compliance, for example, might be one of those things, right? The BMA code of conduct, for example, there are 3 or 4 different bullet points that a vulnerability management program would immediately address. The risk assessment process, everything we've been talking about so far is related to managing risk. So when you look at what's in the BMA, one of the things they want you to do under the risk assessment is identify cyber risks to operations and assets, right? Vulnerability management covers that. They want you to be able to measure the potential impact of those threats to your business. That's covered in the vulnerability management program. Then they want you to monitor and report on it. If we go down into 5.9, we talk about identifying assets. The BMA says an asset inventory list should be in place. It should detail all the information about the assets. It should also be classified in terms of its value, right? So what's critical? What's a critical service that it's supporting? And then lastly, 6.16 specifically addresses patch management. And patch management specifically, if you read what's in the BMA, it basically says that you need to identify, you need to categorize, and you need to prioritize your security patches. So just by implementing the vulnerability management overview, those different tasks within that BMA code of conduct are already in compliance. So let's quickly get into what when we talk about defining a strategy in that first phase, what are we talking about there? So a very key thing to understand is the first thing you want to do is you want to determine the scope, right? And so really what we're saying there is what are the cyber assets and services that you want to be covered within the program? What do you want to be monitored, right? You need to identify that. Once you get those assets in place, you then want to determine out of those assets which ones are the most critical and which services are the most critical. And then you want to map that to what within my operational environment are those systems supporting, right? You want to make sure that you understand how all that's mapped from start to finish. You then want to look at that information and you want to say, okay, out of all of that information, what is the greatest concern we have as an organization? And again, this is where you would work with your management teams to get a good understanding of, from their perspective as a stakeholder, what is the greatest concern to them. Next, we want to determine what we call approved assessment methods. This is basically saying, okay, how are we going to determine that these systems are vulnerable, right? And that could be a variety of things. We're talking about vulnerability scanning tools. You might incorporate annual pen testings. You might do just periodic different types of scans on these systems to go about performing an assessment. You want to determine what sort of impact potentially can be imposed by using those methods. And the reason why that's critical is because you don't want to bring down a system, during production hours, right? So if there's a potential where that could happen, you want to say to yourself, okay, how are we going to handle that, right? And then you want to define any methods related to restricted areas. So if you're under legal obligations or you have operational constraints, maybe you have contractual agreements with your end users or maybe with a vendor or a partner, right? You need to take in consideration all those things when you're doing an assessment on those systems, because you don't want to take anything down and put yourself in a legal situation or breach a contract, right? And then you want to choose the best methods to employ what you're trying to do. And again, we're just talking strategically here, right? What is our end desired result that we're trying to accomplish? At that point, you need to identify the resources, right? Who's going to be involved? And this is where your service provider can really assist with this. Are they going to do it all? Are they going to do certain components of it? Is it going to be kind of a hybrid model, or are we going to do it all ourselves, right? And then lastly, you need to make sure you have budget for it, right? You always have to have some sort of dollars to, at a minimum, be able to purchase the tools required to do these assessments. So at this point, we actually are moving on into the plan phase. And the plan phase is where we're basically putting pen to paper, right? This is where we're actually beginning to identify the how we're going to accomplish the strategy. So the strategy says, hey, here's ultimately what we'd like to do. Now we get into the plan part, and the plan is where we actually detail how we're going to do it. And we begin to document and write those steps down, right? So the first thing you want to do is build out your vulnerability management team. And all that simply means is that you understand the requirements around the patching a particular product, and you're just looking for team members who might provide input. So for example, if a vulnerability comes up and it might impact the server team, you probably want to have some representation of the server team so they can analyze that to make sure that you're not going to create any additional issues. And again, when you're in a smaller organization, you probably already know this, right? So you don't need to run off and introduce and build this huge team. It's probably going to be you as that lone individual, or maybe it's IT. You're going to want to coordinate with risk management. Again, if you're in a smaller shop, you're going to instantly know what this is. But if you're in a larger shop, you probably have risk management. You have a cybersecurity team that you're going to want to funnel this information through so that they're aware of the potential risk of what you're doing, that particular cyber asset. You want to define the remediation timelines. Putting this in writing is very, very important. This is where we are identifying, or we're classifying the sort of vulnerabilities that are being flagged on a system. An example of this would be like critical vulnerabilities, high vulnerabilities, medium vulnerabilities, and low vulnerabilities. And so typically when you deal with a critical vulnerability, if it turns out that, yeah, it's in the wild and it's being exploited, that's something you're going to want to address probably in the first 7 days, maybe even sooner. We recommend at a minimum criticals and highs, criticals 7 days, highs maybe 10 days, mediums, maybe you get mediums and low, maybe you give yourself 30 days, right? Give yourself a 30-day window to address that. So that information needs to be clearly documented so that if somebody else is coming in and running a scan, or if you have somebody leave your organization, there's a written plan that they can immediately go in and identify, and they know exactly what they need to do. You need to define how vulnerabilities should be documented, right? Should be in a central repository. If you have a tool, and we're going to show you a tool in a few slides here, the tool, like a vulnerability scanner or something like that, is going to instantly do all that for you. So it's not like something you're going to have to like put in a Word doc and then transfer into a database system or anything like that. Most modern tools are going to do this for you, so you'll be able to essentially view all of your vulnerabilities across all of your cyber assets. And then this is a big one. Define how exceptions should be handled. So there are going to be use cases where you have systems that are vulnerable. However, you might not be able to patch those systems, right? An easy example of that is a zero-day threat. Those come out all the time. It's basically an exploitable vulnerability that the vendor hasn't addressed yet, right? This happens all the time with, most recently with Microsoft. And usually they're a few days behind when it comes to protecting, or I should say releasing a patch or releasing a configuration instruction set that will harden that system to try to ensure that that vulnerability can't be exploited. When those situations happen, you need to basically have a plan that says, okay, here's how we're going to handle that. We're going to put in what we call compensating controls around there. Maybe we make new firewall rules to prevent certain type of activity going there, or maybe we move something from a DMZ to behind a firewall, right? So it's all going to depend on the situation, but you need to have an accepted process there of how you handle that. And then lastly, you need to define how often you're going to assess your assets, right? So how often are you going to scan your systems? How often are you going to do things like your penetration testings, right? And you have to factor in your compliance needs as part of that, right? So there are some instances where, due to compliance, right, like if you have PCI compliance, you yourself can't do an analysis on that to get PCI approval, right? You can use the vulnerability management program to do everything that it's meant to do, but they have to do a certification, right? So there are some instances where you might have to define how often that occurs, but at a minimum, you should be running scans at least at a minimum every 30 days across your cyber assets. All right, and then next we need to define how we measure how effective we are, right? So in a simple way of stating this is, how quickly are we resolving the vulnerabilities that we're finding, right? Because ultimately that means you're reducing your risk, and that's good for the organization, and management likes to see that as well. And then defining the training requirements. So again, we're talking about a plan here. So you're going to put in writing the individuals who are involved in the vulnerability management program. What tools are they supposed to use? What is the procedure? What is the process? What are the time frames? And you can think of this as kind of like a how-to kit, right? Somebody can come in, they can read this information, and it should literally walk them through how to do a scan, how to properly report it, how to properly report remediation. It's very important that that's written so that when new employees come and go, again, you have this to where you can provide to them and they know exactly what they need to do. And then lastly, I shouldn't say lastly, I'm going to switch over to a couple of websites I want to show you. But one of the key things is you want to identify the sources of your vulnerability information. And again, this is a lot. We're covering a lot here, but a lot of this information is done automatically for you in a tool. There's places you can subscribe to who are going to give you all of this good information. It's not something that you have to go out and constantly Google. There's a ton of automated ways to where you can leverage a way to get vulnerability information. So the first thing is, in your scanning tool, anything that's related to vendor updates is typically going to be published, and it's going to be downloaded into your vulnerability scanning tool, right? So that's a good thing. But some key things you want to look at that we recommend is, if you can subscribe to mailing lists and vendors, those are all great things. Twitter is an excellent source to find out what's going on in the wild. But really, that DHS and US CERT is an excellent place that you can subscribe to. I'm going to quickly share. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to share out another page that we can quickly go through and look at that. So 1 second here. All right, can everybody see the web page? Matthew, Lloyd, can you give me a yes or a no or a thumbs up?
I can see it. Yeah, good.
Perfect.
Yep, we can see it.
So you see there, uscert.cisa.gov. Okay, this is what we recommend to everybody that we work with. Right at the bottom, alerts and tips. Right, click on alerts and tips. And down at the bottom, National Cyber Awareness Systems. There's 4 different things you subscribe to, and you can subscribe to all of them. I personally subscribe to all of them. Everybody at DEG subscribes to them, and again, most of our clients that we work with end up subscribing to this. It's free; it doesn't cost you anything. Okay, let's just take a look at the alerts. So if you click on alerts, you can already see instantly all of the alerts that are related out there to some sort of vulnerability or some sort of threat actor out there that's going on. It's pretty simple. You can go in, click on it, and you can see all the details about what's going on. It shows you the summary, the technical details, gives you everything, right? Not that you would necessarily go in here and click on every single one of these articles, but a lot of this information is already going to be published in your cybersecurity vulnerability scanning tool. But what's nice about this is that if there is an active threat out there, you're going to get an email, okay? And that's going to put, that's going to kind of move things to the top of your list. Oh, I need to be mindful of this. Maybe this is something I need to communicate out to my organization. Maybe we're seeing phishing attempts, right? Maybe I'm going to take this information, draft an email, and send it out to the organization so that they are aware of what potentially is going on and what might show up in their inbox, right? Let's just click back here. And let's go to bulletins. Bulletins is another excellent one. This is one I really like because it breaks down a summary of the vulnerabilities that are being reported on a week-by-week basis. So if we just click on last week, September 27th, right? It's going to give us a breakdown of everything that has been flagged, right? And you see it's going to give you the vendor information. And you might be running some of these digital editions, some of these different Adobe pieces of software. It's not uncommon. Adobe, Java, Microsoft, those guys are constantly coming out with updates for vulnerabilities because they're so widely used, right? So you can quickly go in here, and if you look in here, this is going to give you a good idea of just how many vulnerabilities can come out on a weekly basis. I mean, if we scroll back up, here are just the high ones in red from just last week, right? There's one with Trend Micro, Zoho, that's a CRM system. A lot of organizations use that. Then it breaks it down in the mediums and so on, right? So this gives you a good idea of just the sheer volume that we talked about earlier in the slide and how you have to address this. It can become overwhelming, which again is why having a vulnerability management system is critical. The analysis reporting, very good. This is usually calls out specifics. You can click next, and it like a common one that a lot of folks used over the last year was when Microsoft Exchange had their issues. And then view current activity. This is literally up to time, like up to today's date. If anything has come out that you need to be aware of, this is going to show. It's like a real-time feed, right? And so like today, or actually yesterday, the 5th, CISA released an advisory for Honeywell stuff and ACE controllers. And you can subscribe to this. You can go up to the report and subscribe to it. If you just click around, you can actually type in your email address and you can send it to a distribution list, or you can send it to yourself. So very, very good. It's a very good source for getting vulnerability information. All right, so let me flip back over here. To the presentation. All right, so Lloyd, Matthew, thumbs up. Everybody can see we're back to the presentation slide.
Yeah, we're good.
All right, perfect.
Yes, we are.
All right, and so as we get towards the end of the plan, this is a critical component, right? And again, we're just talking about just document this stuff. It doesn't have to be crazy. Like we have it broken down here, like who's going to do the monitoring roles, who's going to do the remediation roles, and things like that. In a smaller organization, it's probably the individual who's responsible for doing the vulnerability management is going to cross roles between the monitoring, the remediation. IT teams are going to be probably in the remediation process. They may be included in the monitoring process. It just depends on your resources. If you're dealing with a service provider, they're doing all these things for you, right? But again, it's important for you to understand what these roles are and what they're doing. And so when we're talking about monitoring, we're simply talking about individuals who are looking what's going on out there in the wild. They're doing the scans for you. They're telling you what's wrong, what vulnerabilities exist on your cyber assets, right? They're looking at those alerts that I just showed you on the other web page, right? They're working with the remediation team, which is typically your IT team, right? The folks that are actually making the changes to these systems, right? So that's the role they're typically going to play. And then from an authorization perspective, that's where your management or your stakeholders are involved. They're going to, before the IT team goes out and says, and actually makes these changes, right? You want to make sure that it's authorized, right? Make sure that the stakeholders are aware of what's going on, because they might be aware of some little piece that you may not be aware of that could potentially break. And that's really what we're trying to do there, to avoid those things. And then from a documentation perspective, change control, change management, things like that, you should be executing that within your organization anyway, because you are making a change to your assets. And then lastly, there's always a revisionary process, right? So annually, we recommend that you take a look at your vulnerability management program, what's working, right? Identify the things that are working well, identify the things that aren't working well. Like maybe you have an issue with rolling out patches for some reason, right? Maybe it's related to the tool, maybe it's related to the process you have in place, but you want to constantly be revising this process, not to make it more complex, but to make it simpler, to make it more efficient, to make it faster when it comes to responding to vulnerabilities that exist out in the wild. And so ultimately, once we have the plan, now we're ready to implement. And this is what based off of the plan, everything we've talked about, your implementation process should flow like this. The first thing you'll see is your cyber assets are in the middle there. Earlier we talked about the new modern day attack surface, IT, IoT, cloud, operational technology. This process revolves around all those different cyber assets, right? And so the first thing is you're going to run a discovery process. You're going to have a tool. You're going to have a system, your asset inventory list, right? Always identify and map every piece of cyber asset in your organization so that you know what you're trying to protect. Next, what are we going to assess, right? This is the part where we're actually scanning the systems, right? We're scanning the systems to identify, are there misconfigurations? And what I mean by that is hardening settings, right? Permission, a setting on the box itself that's related to a Windows machine or a Linux machine, whatever it might be, network device. The vulnerabilities that are discovered, right? We need to know what those are so that we can get into the analyze phase. At that point, once we know, what's going on from an assessment point of view, we can analyze that information and begin to prioritize what we're going to address first, right? And at that point, once you know what you're going to address first, you can then go to your IT team or whoever is your remediation team, prioritize what should be fixed first, and also determine if it can be fixed, right? You may not be able to fix it right away, but this is the part where you're going to define how you're going to do your best to secure that asset as much as possible, right? And at that point, that's where you're going to involve your stakeholders from the decision-making process. And then lastly, we're going to measure the effectiveness, right? At a minimum, month over month, how well did we do? How quickly did we respond to these events? What are some things that we could change? How do we improve upon it? And then management might need better reporting requirement information, right? Because they have to measure this, or maybe you have compliance that you have to address. So ultimately, what you're looking at here is the continuous management process. It's just continual, right? You flow through and you do these things continually to make sure that you don't become a statistic. Next is a dashboard screenshot of the actual vulnerability management tool that we use. A tool is just a component of this process. You'll notice that I'm sure you've seen through this presentation that we've really talked about processes and concepts and very little about tools. And that's mainly because the tool just plays a very small role when it comes to vulnerability management. The tool is going to do the lifting from the heavy lifting from the standpoint of telling me, hey, what's wrong with these boxes? And then I'm going to leverage the tool to actually manage that previous flow that you saw earlier, right up here. So from here, I can see where are my vulnerabilities in my environment, right? And then show me the priority. And you can see there on the left, you've got by plugin. It's literally showing me the vulnerability, right? And then on the right of that, I can actually break that down by asset. So if you can see, it's pretty small here. That first one says, hey, you've got a Microsoft Office 365 patch. You need to get that on there. And on the far right, it tells me I have 10 systems that need to be addressed, right? Well, out of those 10 systems, which ones are the most critical, right? And this is where you're leveraging your tool to begin to identify and use tags to tag those systems so that the tool is giving you instant intelligence so that you can remove quickly from the analyze and the assess phase directly into the fix phase, right? So that tool is going to help me quickly transition from the analyze into fix so I can get this information out to my remediation team and they can quickly go out and address these issues. The next slide is pretty much the same view. The difference is you'll notice now I've clicked on the buy asset tab, and now my tool is telling me, okay, buy the assets you have in here. Here's the vulnerabilities, all of the vulnerabilities that are related to those particular assets. So very quickly, I can go in and create a filter, and I might have a filter that says, okay, show me all my web servers, right? Maybe those are important to me because they're all public facing, right? Maybe I have a payment portal system that's critical. So I can quickly go in there and say, okay, this is not good, right? But show me the systems that are related to my payment system, right? And I can quickly go through, filter through, and now I've got a plan as far as what I need to address first. So the last phase is really, again, it's the assessment phase. I'm going to quickly go through these bullet points here and just address them real quick. This is something that at a minimum you should be doing annually. You want to go back through everything that we talked about. What is the current state? Is everything implemented the way we want it to be implemented? Are the stakeholders, what do they think of it, right? Are they happy with what's going on? Is the expected outcome something that they like? Where are the adjustments that we need to make? And then you want to look at program information. Things change in an organization, right? You might halfway through the year realize, hey, we need to make an adjustment here. You need to make sure that whatever adjustments you're made, that you're actually properly documenting, right? You want to have a written plan. And then ultimately what you're trying to do is address any deficiencies, right? Identify the gaps, make improvements. And again, the end goal is to simplify this, right? Not make it more complex. So the conclusion of vulnerability management is pretty straightforward, right? In the beginning slide, we asked some simple questions. How do we know where we are exposed? What is the priority? What should we address first, right? And then how do we improve upon addressing those vulnerabilities as we operate as a business, right? And so if you have a good vulnerability management program in place, it's going to go through and quickly discover. It's going to give you the opportunity to analyze and resolve those vulnerabilities. It's going to give you a great understanding of the risks that are associated to your critical services, right? And that's a key thing. And then from a risk perspective, you've now moved from where are we exposed to your exposure. You now know what you need to prioritize first, and you're reducing your risk over time, which is really the end goal of the vulnerability management program. So with that, I'll conclude. That's the end of the presentation. We'll now move into questions. Matthew, should I get over to the Q&A? I don't see any questions on there. So I guess let's open it up for any questions, and I'll be happy to respond.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Matt. If anyone's having trouble with the question functionality at all, you can just pop the question into the chat for everyone to see, and we can address that. We've already addressed a few that had come up during the session. So some of the things that we just put on the last slide there, just a few things to think about, as we get towards the end of this year, and there are some compliance deadlines that need to be followed for insurance entities, specifically in Bermuda. There's probably some gaps in the things that you need to have done. And, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about, filling those gaps. And if you look at what the compliance mandates are, some key questions: are you prepared? Can you meet the deadline? And there's also a question which is an ongoing one with our customers and partners about what happens when you are attacked. How have you handled it? Could you have seen it coming? Is always one of those questions, and a vulnerability management program is a really good way to get ahead of that issue. So if we have no more questions in the chat, let me just check. All right. Matt, is there anything that you left out that you wanted to do before we wrap it up? I'm very happy that we're sticking to our time frame here.
No, I just would like, again, to thank CCS for inviting us to do this webinar. We're here to serve CCS clients. And again, Digital Air Group does everything that we talked about today as a service. So the biggest thing I think I want to make clear to everybody is that while it was a lot of information to think about, you can get all that done as a service. And also, if there are any questions, Matt or Lloyd, that come up later, I would ask the audience, don't hesitate to email you guys. I'm sure you guys can get those questions to us. We're here to help in any way we can.
Sure.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We did get a question about getting a copy of the presentation. We will include some of the questions, some of the content, and be happy to share that information with you. And there was a question from Adrian about, do we offer pen testing? And the answer to that question is yes. So if anyone obviously wants to get a little bit more specific in the types of things that we can do to help you out, just reach out to anybody on this webinar and we'll get right back to you. So in some closing here, Matt, thank you again. That was a great job running through a topic that can be pretty overwhelming at times. helping us make it more understandable. Look, the topic of IT security is hot. It's going to remain hot for a long time to come for very obvious reasons, I think. We did record this session as well, so we'll post that up for those of you who might have missed a piece or would like to share it with somebody. So on the compliance end, the insurance entity deadline is December 31st this year, which we know it seems like it's a reasonable time away, but it is not. Time goes very quickly. We just hope that one of the key takeaways for the attendees here is how important it is for the organization to take the risk of vulnerabilities really seriously and try and be proactive in your stance to manage them. I don't know if everyone on this call experienced the Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp outage on Monday. Now, Facebook likes us to believe that this was a configuration error, but call me a cynic. I have a feeling that might have been slightly more malicious in its nature. But either way, we just have to remember that even the largest, richest, and most powerful companies in the world can experience outages. And for some of us on this call, downtime can be directly correlated to loss of revenue and reputation damage. So thank you very much for attending today. Hopefully the session was what you were expecting and a little bit more. Send us any questions that we didn't get a chance to address. And also, please feel free to drop me a note about any topics you'd like us to cover in our upcoming webinars. Our primary focus is to deliver practical content, high value content that you can immediately use in your environment. So thank you again, Matt Green, for an excellent presentation. And to everyone else, thank you again and have a great day. We look forward to hearing from you in the near future. And
Thanks.
I will end the session right here, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.